Good evening and welcome to Works and Process at the Guggenheim. I'm Caroline Cronson, producer of special events, and on behalf of Works and Process, I just wanted to say how delighted we... Can you hear me now? Fantastic. I'm obviously shorter than I thought I was. We're delighted to be welcoming back Dr. Robert Klitzman, whose resume and job title are truly extraordinary and complicated and can be found in your programs. Bob is very special to us. He's a scientist who loves and venerates the arts and is a great communicator. We look forward to an illuminating evening based on forbidden knowledge. You will all get, I hope, many of you will get to meet and talk to him at our reception upstairs in the rotunda after his talk. So, let me, without further ado, introduce Bob Klitzman.
Well, thank you, Caroline, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you all for coming this evening. And I'm delighted to have a chance to talk with you about forbidden knowledge, ethics and experimentation in science and art. And I got interested in this for several reasons. Several years ago, unfortunately, my father died, and he had leukemia, which is caused by rising numbers of white blood cells in the body. And before he died, the doctor said to us that he had about 3 months to live. Or the doctor said, we can try an experiment. There's no effective treatment, but we could try chemotherapy. It'd be a bit of an experiment that should give him a 50% chance of living 3 to 18 months. And my father, who was a hard realist, he was 78, didn't know what to do. My mother, who was also a realist, said, let nature take its course. We all know about the terrible side effects that chemotherapy could have. She said, let's just go with that. But I, as a newly minted physician, had hopes of science. I had trained to be a physician. I was excited about the possibilities of science. And I said, we should try the experimental medicine, that maybe it'll help, et cetera. And my father decided to do that. Partly, I thought, because of my encouragement. And 3 months later, almost to the day, he died. And it was a horrible death. He was nauseous most of the time, vomiting. But the doctor came up to me in the hallway when he died and said, well, he said the experiment worked. He said, but the patient died. And I was horrified. And many of you may have such similar experiences or know people who've had such similar experiences. But I was very haunted by this experience for quite a while because it made me think whether we had made the right decision, whether I had made the right decision, whether the doctor had framed this too positively, and he in his white coat was very optimistic and sort of spoke of the possibilities of what such a treatment might do. And I also realized how hard it was for people to make decisions about whether to be in experiments or not, whether to be in an experimental trial that may hurt you, but may possibly, for many patients who are in trials, help other people down the line. Was that a trade-off that was worth it? So I began to think about these issues, and there are a number of questions that come up. Experiments on humans are increasing, as we all know. We read about this in the New York Times every day. But how should researchers conduct them ethically? How much should we oversee experiments on humans? Should we oversee them? Should we let researchers just do whatever they want to do when they experiment on us and on as patients? How should we balance science versus moral values more broadly? And this is a great example of that. Should we oversee scientists in some way? We think of scientists as being pure seekers of the truth. They've brought us many wonderful things. They've brought us cell phones that are in all of our pockets. Many of us take medications or will that didn't exist 20, 30 years ago. So science has done a lot of good. But should we oversee it in some way, and if so, how? And in thinking about these questions, I found myself going back increasingly to an earlier set of experiences that I had when I went to Papua New Guinea. And I was fortunate to go there just when I finished college. And New Guinea is located north of Australia, and it's just to the right of Indonesia. It's south of the Philippines. It's the third largest island in the world. and it was thought to be uninhabited up until World War II. And what happened in World War II is Japan tried to take New Guinea because it wanted Australia. And for the first time, airplanes flew over the interior of New Guinea. And it was found that rather than being uninhabited, it was inhabited by 3 million people all living in the Stone Age. And this was the largest collection of Stone Age people we had ever found in the 20th century. And this man, Carlton Gajdusek, who was a mentor of mine, starting in the late 1940s, had suspected that there would be unusual diseases that existed among primitive people around the Earth. Because they'd been isolated from everyone else, they may have unusual genetics, unusual mutations, they may have unusual things they're exposed to in their environment. And so he went around the world seeking primitive people in order to study their disease. And for this, he eventually won the Nobel Prize in 1976. The most important disease he found was a disease in the eastern highlands of New Guinea called Kuru. And this disease, years later, turns out to be the same as mad cow disease. But mad cow disease did not yet exist. That was 20 years, 30 years in the future. But he found that there was this disease that he then sent me to study that caused these holes in the brain. And he called this a spongiform encephalopathy. Spongiform like a sponge because it looked like a sponge. The disease he found also occurs spontaneously in sheep. It's known as scrapie. Because these sheep would rub themselves against trees or along sides of fences, and they would scrape themselves and they would die. And this disease also, he found, causes a disease in humans spontaneously called Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. The most famous person to die of Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease before mad cow disease was George Balanchine, the choreographer who died of it. And of course, more recently, what's happened is mad cow disease occurred. The sheep were fed to the cattle. Cattle were ground up, fed to each other, and then fed to humans, and the rest we know. We now know, I should say, that and I should start by saying when I worked in his lab, we were busy when I was in college trying to find genetic material that was in the brains of people with Kuru that was not in the brains of people without Kuru. Because if we could find some genetic material, some DNA or RNA that was in the infected brains, that would be the DNA of the bacteria or the virus that was causing the disease. But we couldn't find any. And it turned out that whatever the agent was, when we ground up, excuse the gruesomeness, when we ground up the brains of infected people with Kuru and gave them to chimps, for instance, at first several weeks went by, nothing happened. And people said, well, it can't be infectious because any infection would have happened already once you fed the diseased brain to chimps. But Gajdusek waited several years, and only after several years did the chimps get sick. But what eventually we learned, and this is more recently, is that there are normal proteins that are in all of our brains. However, what happens in Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease and Kuru is that they flip, they unravel, sort of like a telephone cord that can sort of get raveled up. Or unraveled, and this then becomes infectious. So it's the same protein, and your body doesn't realize that it's a stranger. Unlike if you get an influenza virus or a syphilis virus or a bacteria, your body sees this is something foreign. Here, your body says, oh no, the protein is the same protein. Chemically, it's the same, but it flips, and it gets other proteins to flip. And I'll come back to this. But I'm jumping way ahead of myself. So when I finished college, none of that was known when I went to New Guinea. And New Guinea consists of very high mountains because Australia is pushing north in continental drift, causing mountains. But New Guinea is on the equator, or near the equator. And so you have very steep valleys that are filled with malaria and swamps, which is partly why no one went there. But I went, and the reason was because though Gajdusek had discovered this disease, and he discovered that it was that the disease was spread by cannibalism. When someone died, the women had no meat in their diet. And so when someone died, the women would consume the person. They would all then get sick. When they died, they would be consumed. The people who consumed them all got sick, and soon up to 90% of the women in the tribe died. And that's the point at which Westerners came in. But what happened is more recently is suddenly there'd be no people with the disease, and suddenly there'd be a group of people with the disease. And Gajdašek thought these may be the people who were at the last feast in each village. But he needed someone to go for a year and study who ate who and when they were getting sick, etc. So I was volunteered for the job. So I went, and it's a beautiful country. There are, again, these very steep valleys. And I would go and looking for villages that would be isolated and in which there were the last feasts to find out how. And the reason we wanted to find out was because earlier there'd been many feasts and people were infected many times. But he thought that if we find the last feasts, we would know how long it took people to die from the feasts. He knew that it took a long time. Now, this may seem obscure, but I actually found these feasts, as I'll talk about in a minute, and it has important implications. So I would trek with my guides, often through a lot of bush. Note the big machete there that he carried. And go to these isolated villages. And I would find old people who remembered the time belong kukum nakaikai, which is pidgin English for the time of cooking and eating people. And they would tell me about patients they knew of and about who ate who, etc. So this was a man who I met, and the disease causes problems walking and problems with coordination. So he, it turns out I found, was at one feast when he was a baby. His mother took him. And it took 30 years for him to get infected, and then he was fine, and then suddenly became infected. This is another woman who was at one feast when she was about 1 or 2 years old, was fine, and again, she has problems with coordination. And the older people, some of them had been at many feasts, would tell me about their family trees, and I was able to figure out whose feasts they were at. As one woman said, this way I'll always have part of my mother inside of me. We can understand that, perhaps. So remember, this is Stone Age. So right, and by the way, one reason this was important is when mad cow disease then occurred several years later, people said that there would be 250,000 people dying of mad cow disease every year. And there'd be millions of people who would die of mad cow disease. And I argued not, because I'd met people who had been at many feasts. These women had been at many, many feasts, and they were fine. And so I realized that mad cow disease is actually hard to get. So I was a bit of an outlier, saying that I thought there'd be few cases. And in fact, 20 years later, there's still only 120 cases of mad cow disease in humans. And also I realized, though, that based on these people who I met, the patients, I realized that the disease could take 30, 40 years to affect people, which means that people who were exposed to mad cow disease in the 1980s may not get sick for 30, 40 years, which is why there are still restrictions on people being able to give blood if they lived in Britain on that time. So all those policies come from this research. So I learned how experiments, which may seem obscure at the time, could end up having important implications years later in ways that we don't know. But again, I'm getting ahead of myself. The New Guineans believe that disease was caused by sorcery and could be cured by sorcery. And I'd get into long discussions with them. They have a very rich belief in spirits. This is from another tribe in New Guinea. This is Spirit House. That's me standing there, just to show you the size of this thing. Remember, built by Stone Age people. They also had sacred areas in the forest, special waterfalls, beautiful lakes, glens, that they felt were a place belong Masalai, place of spirits that one was not allowed to go into. And they served sort of as de facto nature preserves. At times I would say, well, I want to go in there and see what's there, just to see what they would say, naive me. And they would say, well, snakes will come and eat you. And they would get very alarmed. But I learned several things, and I became very interested in how they were able to explain this disease as caused by sorcery and as cured by sorcery. And this man said that he cured the disease. And I said, well, who have you cured? And he'd say, all these people I cured. And I'd say, well, who have you not cured? He said, well, that guy, these few people over there who I thought were the patients, he didn't cure. And I should step back. The New Guineans believed that the disease was caused by a sorcerer taking something that belonged to you. And at first they said, well, they must be taking clothes or taking our axes. And so people would guard all their belongings very carefully, and yet people still got sick. So they said, they put two and two together, and they said, the sorcerers must be taking our food scraps that we're not guarding. And so the New Guineans believe that the sorcerers would take your food scraps and wrap it around a stone. And they dig up stones, say, see this stone? This is the stone that killed my mother. They'd wrap it around a stone, cast a spell on it, and they believe the stone would shake. And I'd say, no, Kuru is caused by a very small little thing like an insect. And they'd say, oh, yeah, well, show it to us. And I'd say, well, it's too small to see. You need a special machine. I'd say, oh, what does it look like? And I'd say, we don't know, because we hadn't yet isolated it. And they'd say, oh, have you seen it? And I'd say, no. And they'd say, that's just magic. It's a stone that killed my mother. Then I said, well, okay, you can cure it. What's the cure? He said, well, for 2 weeks, this man told me, I tell patients that they're not allowed to drink water or eat salt or touch a member of the opposite sex. And I have some leaves, special leaves, at a potion that I make that I give them, and I cast a spell. And I said, oh, well, how come anyone gets sick then? He said, very simple. They didn't follow the treatment. And of course, we hear that in this country. When patients fail the treatment, we don't say the treatment failed the patients. So I became very interested in how they understood this. Similarly, I would say, but look, Kuru used to affect little kids, and now it doesn't, because now no one born since 1960 has the disease. I'd say, well, that shows that my theory's right. And they'd say, no. The sorcerers have seen the evil they caused by killing kids, and now they have repented. And besides, he said, white men know Winham Kuru, people who Winham Kuru. They'd say, white people haven't cured Kuru, we've cured it. I cure Kuru. What are you talking about, your theory about something you can't even see? Right? I cure the disease. And the problem is, anyone who thought they had a headache, because the disease had wiped out 90% of the women, anyone who thought they had a headache thought they had the disease, and they were, of course, cured. So I found this all very interesting and was puzzled by it, because, of course, it showed how people can understand what is a disease, what is a treatment, in very different ways. And whereas we thought we experiment, they were busy using evidence and putting it together in various ways as well. Now, also what struck me is the New Guineans have a lot of what they call bilas, which is they wear feathers, they wear shells, but they never discovered representational art in the area I was. The three tribes where I was never had representational art. I had a little shaving mirror, and at one point I was bored and I drew a little self-portrait. And I drew this thing and people saw it and I was going to throw it away, and they said, no, you have to put it up, and the whole village came by to see it. And then my assistant, this kid, said, draw me, and I drew him, and again, the whole village came. They had seen photographs, but a photograph's reality. There's nothing to it, but to capture the likeness of a thing, not that I'm a very good artist, was to them a surprise. They had no paper, no pencils. They had never thought of that representational art was something you can do, though they had a very vivid, I should say, storytelling art, and they had sort of beautiful decorative arts for their bodies. They would tattoo their faces, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm going to come back to that as well, because I think it shows how limitations and advantages in ways in which cultures differ. Now, this may seem all far away and very distant, but of course we too are busy looking for cures. I should say the New Guineans sought desperately for cures. They built big stockades around their villages, and still the disease occurred. They thought that there was a cure, and they saw that people who were closest to where the main road was, which was an 8-hour drive away, which is where there was a store and there was a telephone and electricity, that those people got better. There was no longer Kuru there because, of course, they had stopped cannibalism earlier because the missionaries got there first. But the people believed they must have a secret prayer. The area where I was paid a lot of pigs, which was the currency to get the prayer, to get rid of the Kuru. And when they paid their pigs, they got the prayer, they said the prayer, and they still had Kuru deaths. And from this they concluded what? They concluded they'd been ripped off. Not that there was something wrong with the prayer. So again, people are trying to make sense of these phenomena as they can. But of course, we still look for cures in various ways in medical science, and a lot of drugs that we seek don't work. We're still looking for treatments for many, many things. And there are major questions, as I said, coming back to my father, about how we think about medical experiments, who should be in experiments, when something is good enough that we should try it in experiment. And of course, a lot of these issues got attention when ACT UP, if you remember, in the late 80s, pushed for the FDA to change its rules. So that there were various experimental treatments that the FDA was saying needed to first be tried in thousands of patients before they could be released to the public. And AIDS activists said, no, we want them now. If there is an experimental treatment, even if it's only been tried on 2 people, we want it now, we'll take the risk. And so again, people began to wonder who should be in studies, how we should think about this ethically, when is an experimental treatment safe enough to be used on a broad group of people. And these continue to be issues. This is from the New York Times, February 4th, 2015. You may have seen this on the front page. A failed trial in Africa raises questions about how to test HIV drugs. There was the surprising failure of a large clinical trial of HIV prevention methods in Africa, and the elaborate deceptions employed by the women in it have opened an ethical debate about how to run such studies in poor countries, and have already changed the design of some that are now underway. So the study, which was funded with $30 million of our money, US taxpayer money, aimed to give women who are at risk of HIV, young women, and in these areas, 30% of young women eventually get HIV. So the feeling was get them when they're HIV negative, give them HIV medicine that they can take so they won't get infected. So the women would come every month and they show, here's my empty bottle, I took the medication, et cetera, and the trial, though, didn't work. People got infected in both sets, both with and without the medication. Only afterwards they looked at the bloodstream of the women and found that the women were not taking the medication. And it turns out that the women thought that the medication would give you HIV. So they had very different understandings of what they were doing. And when asked why they're in the study, they said, well, they're paying us $20 to be in the study. So that's a lot of money. So we'll be in the study and we'll come every month and you give us the medicine, we'll empty it out and we'll show the empty bottle and we'll get our $20. So again, questions about what are people's understandings of being in studies, what are risks and benefits, what's appropriate, how should we design studies? And of course, more recently with Ebola, there have been major questions about the ethics of doing experiments. You may remember, for instance, there was a drug ZMapp that when the most recent terrible outbreak of Ebola occurred starting about a year ago in West Africa, it turned out that there were 5 doses available of a drug ZMapp that was made by tobacco leaves. It's another story. And it was given, the first 3 doses were given all to Westerners. Even though Ebola was affecting 99.99% of the people with Ebola were African, the only 3 people to get the medicine were Westerners, which again caused an outcry. Who should get experimental treatment? How should we think about this? And there continue to be many, many issues, as you know, that continues to be in the New York Times and other news media. When a trial, there was one drug now we know shows it will reduce the risk of Ebola by 15 to 30%. Well, should we now give it to everyone? Will people understand that? Will people say, well, I'm on a drug, so I can go take care of my dying mother now and in fact get Ebola? Will they, et cetera, et cetera? So major questions, again, about how about the human side of doing experiments on people. And of course, there have been other epidemics, H1N1. There continue to be major ethical issues about stem cells and political issues about this. There continue to be questions that will, I think, come back to us about human cloning animals. People can now clone your house pets. There are companies that will clone your house pets for you. This past summer, there was a scandal concerning Facebook. Facebook, it turned out, took 700,000 users, and unknown to the users, they said that for half of them, 1/3 people, they were only going to show positive posts from their friends. So the 1/3 people were only going to get posts such as, I bought a new dog, my sister just gave birth, et cetera. I got a new job. The other 1/3 people were only going to get negative posts from their friends. So they're going to only show them the post saying, my dog died, my aunt died, et cetera. And Facebook was able to manipulate people's moods, it turned out. This was the point of the experiment. And they found that people who only got the positive posts were more likely to post positive things. And people who only got the negative posts were more likely to post negative things. Now, this created a bit of a furor because people said, well, we didn't know we were in an experiment. You didn't tell us we're going to be in this experiment to alter our mood. And of course, there's cyberbullying. So sometimes people, young girls and others, who've committed suicide because of negative posts that they've gotten online. So we're playing with a little bit of fire here. Facebook at first said, well, no, when you scroll down and clicked I accept, it said, quote, we may do research on you. It turns out Facebook only added that after they did the experiment. But it now says we may do research on you, but there are still big questions about, does that mean they can do anything they want with us? Is it okay that we're being researched without our knowledge? Again, these are major issues about what are the ethics of doing experiments on people. Now, I would argue that we look at medicine and experiments in various ways, in sort of complex ways, that we have very ambivalent attitudes towards science. We think of science, on the one hand, as showing us truth and light in the face of darkness. This is a painting of Franklin discovering electricity and lightning that was painted by Benjamin West and is in Philadelphia. This is a painting by Vermeer of the geographer. Again, he's looking toward the light. He's dedicated to finding the truth about geography at a time when the world was still being mapped. This is a painting of Lavoisier, who invented oxygen. This is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art by Jacques-Louis David. And again, you have scientists as being shown to be the pinnacle of enlightenment, the pinnacle of rational thought, of order, of organization, of discovering literally the elements that make the universe, the elements that make us. And of course, there have been wonderful successes. This is Jonas Salk. Sabin, other people have brought us amazing advances with science. But there's another set of stories that we have, which are science gone awry. Frankenstein, most famously. But of course, there have been other scientific advances that have had terrible consequences for human beings. This is Hiroshima, unfortunately. Yet without experiments, we're not able to advance. So experiments have this double-edged sword. They can give us great power, great advantages. They've brought us from the Stone Age to wonderful things that we have in our civilization. This is a painting that's in the Louvre of a doctor examining a patient, examining the urine. And at this point in the 16th century, the only ways that doctors were able to examine patients was by feeling the pulse and looking at the urine. That was it. That's all doctors had in their arsenal for diagnosing patients. Now, of course, we have many, many things thanks to experiments, but my point is that there's a negative side that we need to take into account. Now, of course, scientists aren't the only ones who experiment. Artists also experiment many ways. This is Matisse, a great experimenter. This is Picasso in the new Picasso Museum. And again, Picasso, too, would experiment trying to portray women or various objects in various ways, altering composition of certain basic elements. And this is Leonardo, and at times artists have broken boundaries in pushing and come up against social norms that were restrictive in doing their art and at times could advance science. So again, this is Michelangelo and Leonardo. Leonardo and Michelangelo both would get corpses from the morgue, which was illegal, that they would then cut up to examine human anatomy. And of course, this was against all laws, but they did it, and of course, we are the better for it in many ways. Art also can cause harm in various ways. This is Antonio Canova, who did the wonderful Perseus cutting the head of Medusa, which is in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Unfortunately, he died of marble dust from doing all the sculpture. Of course, obviously, artists, cartoonists could also be harmed in many other ways, like people who don't like their work, they could be murdered. And of course, art can also arguably cause danger when it's in the service of propaganda. So this is from Lili Riefenstahl's film, Triumph of the Will. Many people consider her a great artist, but she used her art to advance the mythology of Nazi Germany. Now, the Nazis also experimented on humans in other ways that caused grave concern. So these are Nazis experimenting on humans. Nazis would, for instance, want to know how long people could survive in the cold before they died, which would be important for soldiers on the front. So they took people in concentration camps and put them in the cold and measured how long it took for them to die. They wanted to know how they could sew back limbs that had been severed, because this was a big issue on the front. You'd have soldiers with their limbs severed, so in concentration camps they would sever people's limbs and then try to find ways to sew them back. It didn't work. But as a result of these horrific Nazi experiments, for the first time, the world came up with a set of guidelines for doing experiments on people. This is the Nuremberg Tribunal, and they came up with basic guidelines that said you needed to get informed consent if you're going to experiment on people. Unfortunately, we in the United States did not follow this ourselves. This is an image from the Tuskegee syphilis study in which there were African-American men who had syphilis. The white doctors from some of our nation's leading medical schools wanted to see what the natural course of syphilis was in these men's bodies, how long it took for it to affect the brain, et cetera, et cetera. The problem is that when penicillin became available as an effective treatment after World War II, the doctors decided not to tell the men that penicillin was available or to give it to them because it would destroy the experiment. This is Nurse Rivers in the middle, who was an African-American nurse who was torn between the doctors and the patient. She was trying to help the doctors and, of course, ended up being in cahoots, or that's too strong a term, but she ended up being morally torn, that she followed what the doctors wanted and was the go-between, but felt a lot of moral strain. Now, as a result of that, the revelations of the Tuskegee syphilis study, in 1974, Congress passed the National Research Act, which set up research ethics committees known as institutional review boards, or IRBs. Now, there are now about 5,000 IRBs in the United States. They exist in every university, every college. At Columbia, my university, we have 6 of them. Most major universities have 5 or 6 of them. And they are charged with making sure that research is safe. Unfortunately, and they do tremendous work. They're very, very dedicated. But there are still problems that come up. There are still debates about human guinea pigs. There are drug company scandals that occur. There are Vioxx, for instance. This is a picture of Dorothy Hamill posing for Vioxx. Vioxx, if you remember, was a drug. The pharmaceutical company knew in its research that it had lots of side effects, cardiac side effects, but didn't want to say anything because it would decrease sales. So they covered it up, and unfortunately, we know what happened. There are debates about vaccines, for instance, but it turns out, as many of you know, recently there was the outbreak of measles from Disneyland. It turns out there's only one study ever published that claimed that vaccines cause autism. This was a study by a surgeon, Andrew Wakefield in Scotland, and he published a paper that said that there were 16 patients he had, young kids, who were fine and then got vaccinated and then within a few weeks developed autism. Turns out he made the whole thing up. Some of these kids never had autism. Some had autism before they got vaccines, et cetera. And it wasn't till a journalist went and uncovered this that we knew about it. In other words, scientists continued to, this doctor continued to have his article stand, and even when it was uncovered, at first the British medical journals involved continued to support him, arguing that no, this was all done ethically, et cetera. So again, there are questions, even though we have research ethics committees, there are large questions that I would argue we all need to be more aware of, and that we need to think about how to address, because in the end they can affect us all. More recently, President Obama, in his State of the Union address in January, proposed that we sequence the entire genomes of 1 million Americans, which I think will help us in many ways discover diseases. But there are questions about what is the role of DNA in our lives. There's been some pushback. I think it's still important that we do this, very important. But there are people who say, well, you know, it hasn't helped homeless people. It hasn't helped many people yet. I think the jury's still out. I think it can help people. But again, there are larger political questions about this, and in part because there are large biobanks. So drug companies and universities want to get as much DNA from as many people as possible because, as some may say, there's gold in them their hills, right? So even though the Supreme Court struck down half of the patents for the company that had patented the breast cancer gene, the other half of patents still stand. So there's a possibility of being able to patent discoveries based on genetics. I should also add, of course, having whole genomes could allow us to discover many things about human genetics. But again, there are ethical issues that come up that I think we need to pay close attention to. There's still genetic discrimination. So the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, or GINA, was passed by Congress a few years ago, and it protects health insurance. But it does not protect life insurance or disability insurance or long-term care insurance. So if you have your whole genome sequenced and you apply for life insurance, a life insurance company can say, have you ever had genetic testing done? If so, we want to see the results. They'll look at the results, and they can now legally say, well, you have these mutations that are associated with disease. We don't want to insure you. We're not going to insure you. Or we're going to increase your rates as a result. So again, these are large issues that we need to address. There are issues with neuroscience, science of the brain. We're finding parts of the brain that many people say light up if you're telling a lie or telling the truth. There are questions, what makes us good and evil? Is it parts of the brain? There's a danger of oversimplifying some of this research as it's beginning to enter courts, but it's there. Another problem is that when the regulations were set up that we now have to oversee research in the 1970s, research was very different. In the 1970s, a lot of medical research was when one doctor wanted to study patients that he treated to see what might work. Now, however, to get thousands of patients in a study to show that one drug is better than an existing drug, you need to go to 60 institutions often, 60 hospitals. And so there are multi-site studies. And so you'll have 60 committees, research ethics committees, trying to decide what to do. The problem is that some committees say, yes, the study's fine. Some committees say, no, the study's not good. Some committees say you need to change this. Some committees say you change that. And it gets hard to compare the studies. And so President Obama in 2011 came out with a proposal that we centralize the research ethics committees. There's been a lot of pushback to that. The NIH in December came out also saying we should centralize these committees. But this is a big issue, not only about the committees, but I would argue more broadly, even if we change the committees, there'll still be larger ethical issues that we need to confront. Part of the problem, of course, is that there's a lot of money involved with medical research, with drug companies, and I think this poses a number of challenges to us. Most basically, I think science has outpaced our understanding of its ethical and social implications. Science is going like this. Scientific expenditures, biotech companies are going like this. The pharmaceutical companies are still expanding. They've changed our lives. But as with stem cells, as with genetics and other areas, we still need to think through, as a society, a lot of the social and ethical questions and implications. Should we have different rules for life insurance companies, saying they can't discriminate? If so, if we say they can't use any genetic information, it might put them out of business. So where do we draw the line? How should we understand this problem? What should we do about it? And I think these are profound issues. And again, in thinking about them, it occurred to me, though, that we can learn quite a bit from the past and from art and from other areas of our humanistic tradition. Problem, of course, is that a lot of this research this science didn't exist in the past. So the Hippocratic Oath is important for us as physicians, but stem cells, genetics didn't exist at the time. Certain elements in the Hippocratic Oath are still important. The Hippocratic Oath says that what I hear as a physician in the home of a patient, I will not repeat outside that home. In other words, there's a basic element of informed consent, of confidentiality. However, the Hippocratic Oath also says one should not perform abortions, one should not perform physician-assisted suicide. So we don't agree with everything in the Hippocratic Oath, but there it is. The first set of laws really put together most broadly was the Code of Hammurabi, and this is the only intact set, which is in the Louvre, and it has about 240 laws. It's from around 1400 BC. And the rules are things like if an oxen is in the market and crushes your little tent where you're selling things, who's responsible? How much can you charge for the oxen from the oxen owner? If a builder builds your house and the roof caves in the next day, is he responsible or not? But of course, it too does, so very important, setting an initial set of laws for us. However, it doesn't address issues of science that we now face. Of course, the Old Testament and the New Testament have many important precepts, but they too were written way before science and technology existed. The Constitution too struggles with these issues, I would argue, having been written before this. When the Supreme Court debated whether or not companies can patent genes, the questions they asked were things like the following. Well, is it like the chocolate chips in a chocolate chip cookie? I mean, is that how we should think of what is man-made versus natural about genes? In other words, if I say that I discovered the gene, is that the same thing as saying, well, I've made the cookie or I made the chocolate chips, et cetera? In other words, it's been very hard for the Constitution written 200-300 years ago, or 200 years ago, to come to terms with the kinds of scientific and technological challenges we now face. I think the arts can help us, though, in several ways, because there's a lot of tensions here. There's not always one single answer. We need to think through these questions as individuals and as a society, and we need to be careful about it. This is a painting of Galileo before the Vatican, before the Inquisition, which forced him to recant his theory that the Earth goes around the sun rather than the sun going around the Earth. He decided to recant it to save his life. But this, of course, shows how regulations against scientists can go too far, which we don't want. This, many of you may know, is in the Metropolitan Museum. This is a painting of Socrates about to drink hemlock by David again. And of course, Socrates was accused by the Athenian government of corrupting the youth of Athens by getting them to doubt the existence of the Greek gods. He was told that he either had to recant his theories or kill himself, and he chose to drink hemlock. So again, there are examples of where government can go, and arts remind us of this, where governments can go too far in limiting what science can do. So we don't want that. And there continues to be a tension. This is Van Dyck's painting of Icarus and Daedalus. So you may remember that they were both stuck in the labyrinth that Daedalus had actually designed to keep the Minotaur in. And to escape, Daedalus invented wings that would allow them to fly out by taking feathers from birds and using wax. And Daedalus, in the back here, told Icarus, his son, don't fly too close to the sun or the wax will melt and you'll drown. Icarus, though, had his own ideas. He wasn't about to listen to the authority of his father. This, by the way, is Van Dyck. This is a painting, a self-portrait that's in the Metropolitan Museum. But if you look, this is, in fact, he painted himself in painting Icarus. And I think the message here is, as an artist, in the time when he lived, he was, a time of there was religious war, Catholics, Protestants, etc. He very much was against the authorities telling him what to do. But again, I think this applies to science as well. This is Rubens' painting of what happened. They, of course, fell. This is Bruegel. If you look down here, this is Icarus's leg popping out. Otherwise, you would know the plowman is doing his thing. Everyone's going about their life, and no one really cares about this stuff. But it is important. And the notion of forbidden knowledge is, I think, we're somewhat ambivalent about, of course. There is the myth in the Bible, of course, of Adam and Eve and the forbidden fruit that God told Eve and Adam not to eat. We know what happened. And on the one hand, of course, we think of science as being this wonderful project, which it is, has advanced our lives. We think of experiments, the experimental method, as really bringing us tremendous opportunities and advances in our lives, but at times I would argue we need to put some constraint given the ethical problems that may arise on what science can do. And I think that this is a debate that we need to set in the right place, because there are people who may set it in other ways, one way or the other, that we may not like. And these myths exist in a number of ways. This is Prometheus, and Prometheus, the Greeks believed, was one of the gods, and he stole fire from the gods and gave it to humans. And of course, fire has made possible metallurgy, et cetera, et cetera. But as punishment, Zeus chained him to a rock, and eagles ate his liver. And he was imprisoned the rest of his life. And of course, this too has been depicted in many paintings. This is Rubens, again, showing much more voraciously the eagle picking at him. But again, the notion that there is a punishment to be had for advancing science and technology is something that I think could be a reminder to us as we move forward. Of course, Prometheus is still with us. This is in Rockefeller Center. Note that this is the good side of the Prometheus myth, right? Bringing us fire, not the bad side of the punishment for it. But these issues are still there. So one of the issues that goes through figuring out how these issues apply on a day-to-day level is informed consent. In other words, when people are in experiments, what should they be told? And there are examples of good and bad. And I just want to show this one clip as an example of a not good informed consent. Well, he basically says, Eliza, I'm going to do an experiment on you. I'm going to teach you how to speak as an experiment. You'll live in my house. I will give you lessons. And at the end of 6 months, we will take you to Buckingham Palace. And if you are able to convince them that you are a lady, you will do great and I'll buy you a shop. Okay, if you fail, it's not working. Okay, if you fail, you will be sent to the tower and they will cut off your head. Okay, and if you say no to this experiment, though, you'll be the most ungrateful girl and the angels will weep for you. And she says, you're a bully. And the maid takes her and grabs her upstairs to get a shower and enter the study. So again, that's informed consent. That's not good. She's not being given much of a choice, right? I mean, she's being told you're going to cut your head off if you say no, et cetera, et cetera. But these issues of informed consent and how much information is appropriate, it sort of gives a slight humorous version. Now, the problem, of course, is that informed consent is still a problem. This is an editorial from the New York Times, April 15th, 2013, an ethical breakdown. Despite reforms to protect patients from being harmed by medical research in recent decades, 23 academic institutions authorized a research project that failed to meet the most basic standard, providing an informed consent document to parents that accurately describe the risks and benefits of the research to be conducted on extremely premature babies. So in this study, when babies are born with prematurity, we give them oxygen. And there's long been a debate of how much oxygen to give them. Because if you give them a lot of oxygen, they'll live, but the high level of oxygen can often leave them blind. If you give a lower level, they won't go blind, but they may not live. It turns out that 93% of doctors give the high dose and 7% give the lower dose. But there's not agreement on the field. And so President Obama and others have argued that we need to do comparative effectiveness research, and so we entered a bunch of premature infants in the study. And what we did is we consented the mothers when they were pregnant, when they were in labor often. And we knew that they were going to have a difficult delivery. However, what the informed consent form said was, the purpose, quote, the purpose of this study is to decrease the risk of blindness and decrease the risk of death, period. It didn't say that it's either one or the other for you. That in other words, you're either going to be in the arm that has decreased risk of death but increased blindness, or decreased risk of blindness but increased risk of death. In other words, you're going to be in one or the other, but the informed consent sort of mished them all together and said the purpose is to decrease both. And also the women weren't told that, in fact, 93% of doctors were giving the higher dose. So if a woman was there, she was thinking, oh, well, it's sort of 50-50, people don't know, and this sounds good. This continues to be a big debate about what should have been done, but the Office of Human Research Protections said that this was unethical. The study had been conducted at Stanford, Duke, Yale, among others, major institutions. There's a lot of lawsuits going on about this at the moment. But again, it suggests that these are very difficult issues of how much to tell people about a research study and who should oversee these forms, whether or not people are in fact being coerced, as Eliza Doolittle perhaps was coerced, not that badly, but in other words, doctors, a lot of researchers want people to be in their study, and or if they give too much information, people may say no. Now this may seem all arcane, I'm not in any research studies, but every day or every month, all of us scroll down and click I accept. Who's scrolled down and clicked I accept in the past month, right? Like everybody. Now, note it doesn't say read and understand and agree. It says scroll down. They don't even want you to read it. And also, of course, what I notice is they give you this much text. The thing goes on for 45 pages. But you can't read the whole thing. You have to just scroll, scroll, scroll. I mean, if you actually read it. And, of course, if you try to read it, you can't. Right? It's dense legalese. Lawyers I speak to say it, it doesn't make sense to them either. But we all do this. And I would argue that this is actually quite unethical, that actually these stand up in court as contracts. But I think we need consumerism to say we should not be forced to use what is effectively an almost a public utility, the internet. We shouldn't be forced to be agreeing to things that we don't understand. That's my 2 cents. But again, and of course, research ethics committees struggle with this. A lot of consent forms for studies are now 45 pages long, filled with dense legalese and scientific details that no one can understand. A problem, of course, is what to put in a short consent form. So even in the arts, this is Vermeer's The Art of Painting, and we see, of course, that the artist, of course, framing what he's presenting. He's not going to present the whole scene. He's only going to present parts of what we then see as the viewer. So scientists, too, have to decide between all the facts. You could write books about some of these studies. What should be in a short consent form is often a challenge. Of course, people have various fears. People may either fear potential side effects. I'm always struck when we see on TV the ads for drug companies, right? The ads for medications, and they show a couple walking off in the sunset, and then it comes the voice, may cause liver disease and this and that and death, and we kind of blithely sort of ignore it. So there's ways of framing fears, and that's a big part of what's involved here. We don't want people to over-fear things that may be wrong, but we don't want them to under-fear them either. I recently bought a little box of Tylenol, a little bottle of Tylenol, and opened up the insert, and it was like this big, filled with dense type that you would need a magnifying glass to see, and even then wouldn't understand. And a lot of the problem is that these are complicated choices. So unlike the past, more often in the past, there were much simpler ethical choices. This is the choice of Heracles between virtue and pleasure. And there have been a few depictions of this. Angler did one. This is Benjamin West. And of course, it's left or right. There's either virtue or there's pleasure. Pleasure on the right with the unclad breast, etc. So very straightforward. But of course, people look at risks and benefits very differently. Some people say, I love hang gliding. Other people say, I would never do this. That this is way too risky to do, to try hang gliding. Of course, some people say it's too dangerous to get on an airplane. Many of us for a long time said that's nuts. On the other hand, there have recently been airplane disasters, unfortunately. So, of course, people have different levels of how much risk they're willing to undertake, and research ethics committees and physicians and researchers need to decide where do we set the right line. And I think part of the problem is now a lot of science involves not just one risk and benefit versus another risk and benefit, but very complicated risks and benefits of varying degrees on both sides. So there may be a terrible side effect, death, but it's rare, or there may be a little benefit, but it's quite common. And how do we weigh these things? Again, when I think back to my father, I wonder, those risks and benefits, were those good enough to take? Should we have ignored that? I mean, at what point would you have said, would have made sense if the doctor had said, well, you get 30 years of life, right? 50% chance of living for 30 years. That would sway it. But what point is the cutoff? If it's 2 years, 18 months, 5 years, et cetera. And I think that this is Kandinsky from here in the Guggenheim, but I think it suggests how there's a lot of chaos now and a lot of very complicated sets of statistics that we don't fully know how to process often, they have to deal with. And I think that a lot of modern art, I think reflects some of this moral ambiguity and lack of clarity. And the problem, of course, is there's also cheating, conflicts of interest that go on, et cetera. This is a painting in the Louvre, and this is Georges de la Tour. This is the Metropolitan Museum of Art. This is the previous one was called the Card Sharks. This is a young man having his palm read while someone who's in cahoots with the palm reader is pickpocketing him. And the problem is that, of course, there's people, researchers, drug companies, institutions that want money from research. It's become a big business, and that can affect what happens. People may be tempted to enter studies for various reasons. This is Vermeer. I'll come to this in a moment. But the problem, of course, is that researchers often want people to be in their studies. Science is good, but we don't want them to be overly swaying people, as we saw with the support study or with My Fair Lady. Justice obviously is important, is a wonderful thing, but of course the weak may not get justice, and there are vulnerable people. There are patients with mental illness who are often studies. There was a recent decision about a case in Minnesota where a schizophrenic young man was entered into a study when he was psychotic. He killed himself. His mother had apparently been trying to tell the researchers that he doesn't understand the study, he's suicidal. The researchers wanted to continue him in the study, and there's been a large court case. The state legislature in Minnesota decided that there could people with mental illness, with psychosis, cannot be in any research studies. I think that's not the answer either, because we want studies on people with schizophrenia. But again, where to draw the line between how much risk we accept and how much is too much is hard. Again, justice could be overruled in other ways as well. And of course, a major problem is that there's a huge amount of research being conducted in the developing world. So most biomedical research at this point is paid for not by the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, or by government, but it's funded by industry, by the pharmaceutical industry. And most of it is now conducted in the developing world. So if you're a drug company, just as our cell phones are made in Vietnam and China and India, it's much cheaper if you want to study a new drug to study it in Vietnam or China or India or Estonia or Latvia or Lithuania rather than studying it on the Upper East Side of Manhattan or anywhere else in the United States. But the problem is, as we saw earlier, is that people in other cultures, particularly in the developing world, may have very, very different beliefs about what is a disease, what is a treatment. They may not understand what we're doing. They may be illiterate, or they may be semi-literate. They may easily feel coerced. Recently, I was in sub-Saharan Africa interviewing research ethics committee chairs there. And I said, what's the biggest issue you face? And they all said one thing: money. They said, because if you pay people $500 in the United States to be in a study, if we give people $500 to be in a study here, that's a year of salary. And we'll be unduly influencing these people, coercing these people, sort of what we saw with My Fair Lady a little bit, perhaps, so that's extreme. On the other hand, if we say you can have our people cheap, only $50, we're letting you have our people cheap. We're letting you exploit our people. So what do we do? And again, these are very difficult moral issues that I think science, which gives us wonderful things, is presenting us with that we all need to think about. And of course, research ethics committees, the people making these decisions, are mere humans. They try their best. But science has changed. Science is advancing. It's very hard to keep up. This is Juvenal, who was a Roman satirist, wrote a series of poems called The Satires, one famous line of which is, "Who will guard the guards?" If we have these committees, how should we oversee what they in turn are doing? And again, Obama's wrestling with this, other people are wrestling with this as well, but I think it's something we all need to face. This is a painting of Election Day that's in Winterthur that I've always liked because it shows the sort of the messiness of the electoral process. We think and of our democracy and of conversations about political directions we should go in. And the problem, I think, is that we're increasingly at a crossroads. I think there's a dearth of moral thinking, of ethical thinking that infuses how we approach these issues. This is a painting by Poussin that's in the Louvre of time carrying off truth from the clutches of envy and discord. And I think there were a series of paintings like this in the past. This is Veronese in the Louvre also. I went to the Louvre recently, you can tell. And this is Jupiter throwing lightning bolts at the vices. And here are the vices with money and rope for tying people up, etc. This used to hang in the Palace of the Doges in Venice on the ceiling in the center, over the council chamber where political decisions were made, as a reminder that the leadership should get rid of and throw lightning bolts at the vices. And I think these are important reminders to us more broadly, not just in science, as we go forward. Another problem as we look at these issues, and I've learned as I've been reflecting on this, is that committees differ, and we all differ in how we look at ethical issues. There's important ethical issues and moral issues involved in science, for instance. This is a still from Akira Kurosawa's film Rashomon. Many of you may know the film. There's a murder and a rape that takes place. And there are 5 characters, each of which give a completely different account of the murder. One character is, in fact, the ghost of the guy who's murdered, and his account differs from the account of the wife, the account of the bandit, et cetera, et cetera. And the point is that I think for Kurosawa believed that perhaps there is no truth. We all look at these things differently. And when we think about it, even with ethical concepts, I think we need to advance our understanding of them, both in science and elsewhere. So George Bush, for instance, said, "I believe in freedom, so we should invade Iraq." Other people said, "I believe in freedom, so you should get out of Iraq." So we have in our political discourse and in our thinking, we use these terms and yet may define them very differently. Even with Obamacare, many of us believe that justice in healthcare is that everyone gets a certain minimal amount of healthcare. Opponents of Obamacare, many of them say, well, no, I believe in justice. I believe that if you put more money in the system, you should get more money out. And if you don't put any money into the system, you shouldn't get anything out. That's justice. So again, we have different competing definitions of these basic ethical principles. We interpret and apply these same ethical principles differently. And I think that's partly what we need to think about more in science and technology, but more broadly as well. And of course, there are issues of power as well. This is Abu Simbel in Egypt. When I first asked researchers, what do you think of research ethics committees and et cetera, they'd say, well, they have tremendous power. They can tell us we can't do research. When I asked research ethics committees, what do you think you have power? They all said, we don't have any power. We're just following the regulations. But of course, we know, for instance, with police that there's discretionary power. So the police have often said, well, we don't have any power. We're just following the law. But as unfortunately we all too painfully know, who the police decide to pull over or shoot or not is not arbitrary. They use their power in discretionary ways. And it's forced me to think about also how we think about power more broadly, not just in science, but elsewhere as well. And we need to get the right amount of, as I said, with science, of overseeing science and technology. Figuring out how much we should oversee it is a challenge, because we don't want to either oversee it or undersee it. And I think figuring that out is a difficulty as we go forward. And of course, we live in a world that is facing climate change, technology which has brought us many wonderful things, electricity, cars, et cetera, airplanes is also threatening the health of our planet. And again, we're faced with dilemmas of how to oversee the science and technology that bring us wonderful things, but can carry costs as well. And where to draw the lines, I think, is a very important issue that we can't just leave up to scientists, politicians, or people doing the technology, that we all need to become much more involved in if we're to be healthy moving forward. I recently had a conversation with a friend of a friend who lives near here, a very intelligent guy, and I'd see him at other parties and we'd chat. And then I somehow ended up talking about climate change with him recently. And he said he doesn't believe in climate change. And this is an intelligent guy. I said, why not? And he said, this is showing the surface temperature of Earth from 1980 to 2005. And as you see, it goes up and down, sort of like the stock market, but the overall trend is up. So he said, well, I don't believe in climate change because he said, do you know that the temperature in 2000 was higher than the temperature today? Which it was, right? But of course, that's distorting the statistics. Yes, it was, but the overall trend is up. And again, I think we need to be careful how people are using science and be aware that science can be interpreted in different ways and be increasingly careful about this. I think a problem is that people used to get their moral compass from church or going to synagogue, and that to some degree, we've lost that. People, as Americans, we no longer do that as much. If you say you're interested in morality or morals, people think you're on the right. They've co-opted the term. But I think there are important moral principles that infuse the rest of us, and we need to work on developing our vocabulary and way of thinking about that in science and technology and elsewhere. And as a teacher, I do this all the time. I have students who say, I'll present a problem, a moral problem. They'll say, well, it just doesn't feel right. And so we need to give people, I think, the tools to think in terms of risks and benefits, to think in terms of rights of people, of justice, of informed consent. Those are terms that many of us don't feel comfortable using, but I think increasingly we need to. And so I come back to New Guinea because I learned a huge amount there. I went back 17 years later, and I should say the kid I drew grew up and named his first son after me as a result of my having drawn him. In New Guinea, though, you get one and only one name. So this kid's name is Klitzman. So when I went back, I'd hear Klitzman, and I'd turn around, and there's this little kid, Klitzman. Poor kid. I shouldn't say that. But anyway, I realized how we look at these issues very differently. I realized how good experimentation has brought us amazing things that have improved our lives and improved lives of people all over the world. That didn't exist in earlier stages in our development as humans and culturally as well. But we need to be very careful. Many of us look at these issues very differently. We think of science and technology as something that's very pure, but in fact it's very much embedded in our lived lives, in our cultural views, in our political views, in our psychologies, and we need to be very careful as we move forward. There are important ethical issues and moral issues that we're increasingly facing. And these too we look at in a variety of ways. This is my book that just came out called The Ethics Police, The Struggle to Make Human Research Safe, that goes into a lot of these issues in more detail if you're interested. But I want to come back with this image of the Earth, because I think we as a planet are in trouble. And I think that we're in trouble because of science and technology and the ways in which we think about the ethical issues or don't think about it. The problem is that we have a somewhat impoverished sense as a society of the ethical terms with which to deal with these issues. We need to think much more carefully about how we all get together to think about what is right and what the ethics and morality of science and technology are if we're to continue to flourish as a society, as a world, as individuals, and continue to have the great future that we've had. So on that note, I thought I'd stop, and lots of questions, and I hope that you all continue this conversation, because I think that the more we can all think about these issues with our friends, our family members, our political leaders, our institutional leaders, the better off we'll all be now and in the future. So thank you very much.